reading some scary stories I found on Reddit from the Pacific Northwest. I'd been going to college here in Washington State for 2 full semesters before I finally decided to join a fraternity. I'm not a party animal or anything, but the stories I'd heard about a particular fraternity's parties were enough to convince me that I had to do whatever it took to join it. Initiation week was exactly what you'd expect. They made us stay up for several nights in a row, eat some raw sardines, stuff like that. The crowning moment of initiation was that each initiate had to spend a night in the so-called murder forest just outside the city. This forest is famous in our area for being haunted. Apparently, several serial killer victims were found there. And on top of that, people hear weird sounds sometimes. Still, lots of places have local legends, and I figured that the stories had been exaggerated to enhance our hazing experience. So the 6 other initiates and myself hopped into vans and were driven to the edge of the forest. One of the older members told us that we should walk for about an hour along a path and that we'd find a campsite where we could spend the night. Each of us was carrying a backpack with a sleeping bag and tarp to lay on. I had been walking with the other guys in the group for 45 minutes and an idea crossed my mind. The rules we'd been given said we had to spend the night in the forest, not that we had to spend it in a particular area. They wanted us at that campsite so they could come in during the night and mess with us. I had no doubt. So I decided to set off into the woods by myself to avoid the hassle that sleeping in the designated campsite would bring. I congratulated myself on my smarts, thinking I had avoided any trouble. I was wrong. I walked for another 15 minutes or so by myself, lighting my way with a flashlight. I found a nice secluded spot with a clearing. I looked around and saw it was completely empty, so I set up my tarp and laid out my sleeping bag. The forest was alive with the sounds of crickets, birds, and wind. I lay down in my sleeping bag feeling satisfied and flipped off the light. The forest fell silent. I don't mean to say that the wind lulled, or that there was a momentary lapse in crickets. I mean that everything that could make a sound stopped making noise all at once. It was so sudden and so complete that I thought I had gone deaf. I pulled my hand up to my ears, but when I rubbed my fingers together, the soft rustling sounded out like normal. I looked around in the pitch darkness, but a thick layer of clouds made the night nearly absolutely dark. I was fumbling for my flashlight when I felt it. A warm, humid breath spread across the back of my neck, like a person was standing 6 inches behind me, blowing slowly. It stood in stark contrast to the chilly early spring air I had been feeling up till then. My hand found the flashlight, and I spun it around, illuminating the clearing behind me, revealing nothing but grass and trees. The instant my light turned on, the sound returned to the forest, crickets and cicadas chirping away softly. I started to stand up to leave, but stopped myself. I had to have been psyching myself out. All the stories from the frat must have just been getting to my head. I couldn't explain the silence, but I resolved to stay the night. I laid back down with the light and finally turned it back off. I half expected the forest sound to go with it, but thankfully the crickets and wind stayed constant. I laid in the darkness for a while, trying to relax my heart rate enough to fall asleep. After what must have been half an hour, I finally drifted off. I don't know how much time passed, but I was woken up by a new sound. It was the sound of rhythmic heavy breathing, occasionally broken up by mumbling. The sound was coming from in front of my sleeping bag and high above me, probably some 30 feet away. I pulled out my phone and opened the camera app. I took a picture with the flash to light up the clearing and saw a figure in the trees staring down at me. It was a woman wearing a long white dress. She had long black hair that covered her face, and her face. It looked like the skin had worn through in places. She was staring down at me. The image from the flash was burned into my mind. I kicked out of my sleeping bag and started running away through the forest in my bare feet. I couldn't hear motion behind me, but I didn't stop running until I reached the edge of the forest where I got cell service. Here is the picture I took of the woman. I grilled the members of the fraternity after I got back, but they each swore that they had nothing to do with it. I had been right about them scaring the other members of the group, but they had just used air horns and guns with blanks to scare them while they slept. I guess it's possible that they were behind it all, but I can't see how they could have made the forest silent or breathed on the back of my neck when not even the other initiates knew where I was. And that woman was not something fraternity members could have created. Okay, so I live on the east side of Washington. Recently I went on a drive that I take a lot. It follows the Spokane River for a ways. I went further than usual, driving about 50 miles out, taking pictures and stuff like that, because I bought a camera years ago and just never used it. I didn't even end up taking any good pics, but it was still cool to go out further than I had before, although I will never take this drive again. It does follow the river, but there's also some pretty thick woods in the area too. I don't know about other places around Washington or the Northwest, but we have painted rocks, old Indian paintings that have been preserved on their original rocks with a gate to keep people from messing with them. Up until that day, I thought we only had the one, but on that drive, I saw another one, although the gate was definitely too short and anyone could jump it to get to the paintings. As I was driving back, it had started to get dark. I was a good 30 miles away from town when I saw what I thought was a coyote. Now, I grew up in a hunting family. I've seen more coyotes than I could count, but I remember being pretty excited because I hadn't seen one in years. It was just off the side of the road behind the wall that'll keep your car from going off the road. But as I got closer, it stood up on its hind legs. That thing definitely wasn't a coyote. I know what a coyote looks like, and they are definitely not taller than a person on their hind legs. By the time I passed it, it had ducked behind the wall and I was in full panic mode. I was still a good ways away from town, by myself with no service. I ended up almost flipping my car going around some sharp turns because I was going close to 80 in a 35 zone. I honestly just wanted to get back into town, but every now and then I'd see it out of the corner of my eye in the trees. Now I am fully aware of the fact that it was dark and I was terrified, so all of those times could have been my mind playing tricks on me. But the first time I saw it, right by the road, I know what I saw. That wasn't my mind playing tricks on me. But I also don't know much about the legends about the Spokane tribes, or if we have skinwalkers or dogmen up here. But I don't know how else to describe it. I mean, what really freaked me out I think were the eyes. Again, hunting family. I remember growing up my dad always telling me to look out at the trees while driving at night, and if I saw two glowing things it meant there was an animal. I had spotted plenty of deer and raccoons that way as a kid, but whatever that thing was, its eyes didn't glow. I didn't get a good look at its eyes. Again, I was more focused on getting the hell out if there rather than looking at what eyes it had. But human eyes don't glow. I honestly think that's what bothers me the most. So if anyone can give me information, or if it wasn't a skinwalker, if anyone knows what it could have been, please let me know. A few weeks ago, bordering Spokane and Airway Heights, I was driving at 4 in the morning and saw what looked to be a tall figure that was using the trees as concealment. However, they were leaning their head into the road, looking in my direction, and I saw these big round eyes shining brightly as my headlights were beaming. The figure did not blink, but very slowly moved back into the tree line. I immediately thought it was a young moose, as the face was a little long towards where the top of the mouth would begin, but the more I looked, the more the figure looked like a distorted man. The face from the bottom of the nose and up looked human, but that facial expression was anything but human. It had hair, something like Shaggy from Scooby-Doo, and had to be at least 7 feet tall. The way it moved back into the tree line was deliberately with caution as to not make the vegetation around it move much. Mind you, by the time I saw it, I slowed down to a slow 15 to 20 miles per hour, enough to really see the face. As the car was passing through, I kept looking at the rearview mirror to see if it would cross the road or anything, and it did no such thing. I eventually made it to work and told my coworkers. One of my coworkers is a native and was telling me about a creature that one of the tribes believed to exist. He was saying that this creature called the Windsor or something like that essentially eats other humans and lives in the woods. They're apparently known to chew on their upper lip or pieces of their own face if they haven't had a meal in a while. My coworker finished up the tale by saying, "Animals don't move like that. At 4 in the morning, anything outside should be an animal and animals don't move like that." I haven't seen that creature since, but it's definitely alarming because I've traveled the world, day and night, and I have never seen anything that remotely looked like what I saw that morning. Eastern Washington is freaking bizarre. There is weird stuff here, weird people, a very odd small town between Eastern Washington and Seattle. I am an electrician, and my company was hired to add circuits to a historic building in downtown Vancouver, Washington. This building was and is a theater, with rigging above the stage. My apprentice and I were working above the stage, about 10 feet apart from each other, with a tool bag and spool of wire between us, so we could grab tools and wire without too much movement. These catwalks are narrow and kind of rickety. I needed a nut driver out of my bag and asked my apprentice to hand it over, and while he was moving to get it, the whole bag slid across the textured catwalk to my feet. Now, this bag is about 25 pounds and has its own textured bottom to keep it from sliding. We both saw it move. He looked at me and said, "Did you see that?" I said nope, and we went to a long lunch. True story. This happened to me about 4 or 5 months ago, but I camped up near Cougar, Washington. Common camping area near St. Helens that has a little store and is close to the Ape Caves with a waterfall and small creek for swimming in. I had just graduated from high school, and me and my buddies and ex decided to head up into the woods for one last camping trip before college and the military. The tent setup was one large tent hosting for people, my tent which was just me and my ex, and another tent further away from mine but close to the forest line like mine was. The large tent was in the middle of camp next to our cars and fire pit. Night rolls in and my ex has to use the restroom. I bring 2 of my friends with me while waiting for my ex to use the bathroom. It's pitch black out and the camp store nearby the restroom has long closed. The restroom is next to the store, but there's a big parking lot separating the restroom from the main road. Across the parking lot from me is a single tree, and what looks to be a maybe 8-foot white pole I could clearly see in the dark. Me and my friends are all staring at this tree, trying to figure out when this pole got there, as we hadn't seen it earlier in the daylight. I watched as the pole moved to the other side of the tree, which really confused me, but I honestly thought it was just a perspective issue. After watching this happen a few times, just the pole swaying side to side behind the tree, my friend asks us if we're seeing the pole move too. I freak out, my heart drops, and I get the worst feeling. The other friend we're with, one of those non-spiritual, very science-oriented people for some background, agrees that the pole is moving, which scared me even more. We watch as the pole moves side to side for another 5 minutes or so until my ex finally gets out of the bathroom and I tell the group we need to leave. We walk quickly back to camp. It was late season and the other campsites were practically empty. We sit around the fire and talk for a while before finally heading to bed. My ex was assaulted during a camping trip, so he has bad trauma surrounding camping, which is why we had a separate tent. We kept the zipper locked, which I thought was weird, but my ex said was perfectly normal. We spend the night talking between us and listening to the other tense conversations before finally deciding to sleep. I have some real sleep issues, so I stay up maybe 2 hours later than my ex. Right as I'm nodding out, almost ready to sleep, my ex whispers something. Confused, I whisper a what? Back. The whisper gets louder and more excitable, but I can't make out what it's saying. I ask what? Again, slightly louder. No response from my ex, but I hear a mumble this time. I finally just loudly exclaim, What? And my ex wakes up and rolls over confused. I asked him if he had been talking, but he claimed he had been asleep for about an hour. I heard nothing, approach the tent, or leave. It freaked me out. Immediate alarm bells went off for me and my gut dropped and told me not to move or react. I tried to sleep, but eventually the sun came up. When the rest of the group got up to eat breakfast, I brought up the whispers to a close friend of mine who was sleeping in the other two-man tent with another friend of mine who had passed right out the night before. My friend claimed the exact same story, whispers from the tree line, but this time he claimed he had thought the whispers were me playing tricks on him at like 2 in the morning. He said he hadn't heard anything approaching or leaving either. Neither of us can explain what we heard or saw that night today, unsure if it was a tweaker or not, but we returned to the camp store that following day and there was no pole next to that tree. Practically backwoods, since it was in a place nestled in the deep forests of the Cascade Mountains. I've told this on Reddit before, and I know there has to be a logical explanation. We were in Skykomish overnight in July 2007 for an event, and there also happened to be some kind of town reunion, so the hotel was full. My youngest was almost 1 and woke up crying and simply would not stop, which was unusual for her. I grew concerned that she would wake up people in the rooms nearby, so went out to the car to drive around a bit, thinking that might soothe her to sleep. Skykomish is a tiny mountain town on Highway 2, along the Skykomish River, and the railroad does stop there for freight. It consists of a 4-block square of streets, and a bridge crosses over the river to Highway 2, which I would not cross since I didn't want to be on the highway at night. Around and around, slowly, and with the window down, as it was warm, I drove the square, while my baby was quiet, but she would immediately cry if I went back to park at the hotel. Back we went, and the entire time I could hear the frantic cries of birds, yet could never see them. This twittering never stopped, and it didn't sound like bats, yet I still don't know what birds were crying in the dark like that. The strangest part was that I could drive alongside the rail yard, in full view of the trains, tracks, and buildings, where I could hear clanging and men talking, which seemed comforting except that I never spotted a single person. There were lights, and train engines were running, yet all this bustling activity never revealed the sight of a single person. The worst part for me was that my baby never went back to sleep until after daybreak, so I was out the entire night among all the unknown noises. As I said, I don't think it was supernatural, but I wish I knew what the sounds were. I thought of it a couple years ago when a young woman named Gia Fuda disappeared there and was feared dead, yet was found 8 to 9 days later, alive, sitting naked next to the river, with no memory of where she'd been. I will never stay overnight there again. I have a couple of very minor ones, both Olympic National Forest. I've spent tons of my life in the forests of Washington, including some very minimalistic backcountry long-distance hikes, and these are the only truly unnerving things that happened. The first was maybe 2010, hiking on the Colonel Bob Trail, and it was fairly empty because it was a rainy day and the trail was partially washed out at the time. We only saw one other person the whole time, a man we first passed resting against a rock, carrying a rifle. My friend started chatting to him and asked if he was hunting, and he said no, he was actually out training for an upcoming hunting event. After this, we passed him repeatedly without ever seeing him pass us, and without him saying a word to us. Often he was just crouched in the bushes off the trail, watching us go by. I get that he was just a very skilled stalker who could move quietly off the trail beside us, but even though I know this was just his hobby that had nothing to do with us, it sort of felt like we were the targets of the stalking and made me uneasy. The second, I think it was 2019, was weirder. We'd been camping for a few nights, just sleeping in the van in spots around the national forest, having a great time. Moonlight, full sky of stars, owls and insects, the whole experience. We hadn't seen any other people in the forest itself, but it was very lively and safe feeling. On the third night, we were fairly deep somewhere southeast of Quinault, and the atmosphere was completely different. There were a ton of fires going in Washington and Oregon, so the air had gotten really thick with smoke. Then fog had rolled in off the Pacific, and the two together completely absorbed all noise and light. There was no wind at all, no rustling of trees, and not a glimmer of light. With the headlights of the van, visibility was maybe defeat, but with them off, it was Space Mountain levels of darkness, like you could not see your own hand an inch from your face. I opened the van door to get out and urinate before sleeping, but decided against it. The air was seriously just so thick, still, and dark that it made all my hair stand on end. Plus, we'd parked on a road with steep switchbacks, so I was a little bit worried I'd walk off a cliff. Since neither of us were risking going outside, we went straight to bed. As we were drifting off, there was suddenly pounding on the middle side window, right above where I was lying and on the side facing the trees rather than the road. It sounded like an angry person banging on it with the side of their fist. We both went dead silent and still. Then my friend roared, "What?" in a comically deep voice. No answer, but maybe 10 seconds later we heard a slow tap, scrape on the side of the van. My friend had lived in this van in Seattle for 5 years and had had plenty of people actually trying to break in and basically just shooed them away. But in that moment, he said, "F this," and we got into our seats, got our seatbelts on, and left. Like, maybe there was someone camped nearby, but they definitely weren't behind us, or to the right or left of us. And the worst part is that it was a gravel forestry access road, with gravel on both sides of the car, on the most oppressively silent night I've ever experienced, and we didn't hear a single footstep. I think the absence of footsteps is actually what gave both of us the sense of urgency, because it did not feel like this was a drunk grouse hunter trying to pull a prank. One time on the logging roads of Silverton, Oregon, me and a family friend had a rock thrown at our truck windshield. It left a chip dent in the glass. No one else was up there with us. We saw trees broken in straight lines about 8 feet in the air, all over the place, and something paced me in the trees. Another time, my brother and I were camping on the coastal range near Pacific City, Oregon. We were in the middle of the wilderness, away from any hiking trail, where no one really goes. After we got in our tent, everything got dead silent, and someone or something big on 2 legs started walking around our tent at midnight. Eventually, it walked right up and stood within inches of the tent, and when I unzipped the fly and shined my flashlight out, nothing was there. Our flashlights kept on dying throughout the night, and eventually, we left because the experience creeped us out. It was a very strange feeling for sure. My brother confessed he'd been seeing weird figures in the tree line throughout the evening, but hadn't said anything before because he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. My cousin and his buddy have heard whoops, mumbled chatter, and got bluff charged while in their tent while hunting deer down around Roseburg, Oregon. I know an old-timer who I trust says he's seen a Sasquatch around Silver Falls, Oregon. I've got a couple of buddies who swear they've seen one together up around Camp Meriwether. My dad and I camped up on Gold Butte Lookout, near Detroit Lake, and saw mysterious lights cruising around the ridges and mountainside of Mount Jefferson. My dad thought they were just cars or ATVs, and they could have been, but they were big, bright, and strange, and I think they could have been UFO crafts or the glowing orbs of light that often get associated with Bigfoot, the Fae, and the supernatural in general. I work out in a very isolated stretch of the Olympic Peninsula of Washington State, and I've had an alarming amount of strange experiences while out here. The basic things that happen are humans screaming far away in the woods. It's a really dense rainforest with no trails. Hearing high-pitched voices say 1 or 2 words like "thank you" and "again." Sometimes I'm all alone and sometimes my boyfriend will be here and hear them too. There is a really upsetting presence that sometimes appears to be a tall shadow that crouches and peeks out from behind things in the dumpster area, and all but a couple of my coworkers have had unpleasant experiences while taking the recycling out. Another friend saw a face gliding by her window like it was on a skateboard, looking straight in. Until recently, it's been mainly ghostly happenings around here, but in the past week we've had some things happen with strange lights. The first thing that happened was my boyfriend and I waking up to our bedroom being flooded with an intense bright light. We just stared at each other while it was happening for a good 20 seconds, and then the light just flicked off and the room went back to pitch blackness. Our room backs up to a dense forest, and we promptly looked outside to make sure nobody was there. As soon as the light flicked off, nothing but pitch blackness and no movement. 2 nights ago, a coworker of ours was returning home late at night, and when he got out of his car, he saw an orange ball hovering over one of the housing units. It did a couple of loops and popped out of sight at about the same time as he started feeling scared. I posted a few creepy stories from working here last season on the sub, and it was just as strange this season. The lights are a new thing though, and a pretty different kind of scary. My boyfriend and I had a strange and terrifying encounter while camping in the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest on a Friday night. I looked online and found a few mentions of alleged Bigfoot encounters, but not very many stories, and nothing else encountered and recorded that I could see. I'm trying to make sense of my experience, and was wondering if anyone has had any unexplainable experiences in those woods. So on Friday evening, my boyfriend and I drove up to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest underneath Mount Rainier. The trip is a surprise to him. He knows that we've been planning on going camping, but as his birthday is coming up on Saturday, I told him we were going to a smaller, lesser-known campsite, but actually planned to go to Mount Rainier, since that's something he's been wanting to do for a long time. Unfortunately, when we arrived at the Cougar Rock campsite, all of the spots were full. I had tried to reserve a campsite earlier, but had not figured it out and was counting on first-come first-serve camping. I had clearly underestimated the rush of tourists, but was reassured by the fact that all of my life I have been camping in various national forests outside of marked campgrounds with my family. I knew that it would be no issue to pull off into the public forest and set up a bed in the back of the truck. We drive for a good while into the forest, and we see lots of people who are clearly in the same predicament as us. They are camped on the edge of the forest, pulled off on the road. We drive for a good while into the woods. It's probably about 10:30 or 11 o'clock p.m. at this time. We finally find a perfect turnoff from the road and hop outside of the truck to check it out. The first thing that I noticed was that it was the darkest night that I have ever seen. The stars were incredible, but also, if I was to shine my phone flashlight ahead of me, the night would sort of swallow almost all the light it cast. My boyfriend and I took a look around the area to make sure that there were no surprises, and those things were very quiet and very dark. Everything felt okay. There were 2 trails leading into the woods from where we parked, relatively close together. We followed each of them, hoping that they would lead to a small campground. Neither did. The trails ended in a small clearing that dropped off into a black ravine. One of the trails, the one on the far right, had a singular large wooden stick that I assume was taken from already fallen wood hammered into the ground before the big ravine gully thing. I pointed my flashlight into the darkness, but couldn't make anything out. We decided we liked the privacy, and that we would be able to hear anyone or anything if it was climbing up the side of the ravine. We started unpacking the front of the truck. It is important to mention at this point that we had rented a U-Haul for this trip, which was a strange aesthetic choice, but the rental car was about $600, so that wasn't happening. We were pulling our things into the back of the truck where we were planning to sleep. We set up dinner, and we were getting ready to eat when my boyfriend looked at me and asked me if I had heard something. He told me to be quiet, and we sat in silence in the truck. A second later, I heard a very strange mix of a phone vibrating, growling, and the sounds of steps on gravel. Exactly like someone or something approaching the truck from the upper left-hand side, coming towards the front of the truck to the driver's door. Both of us are spooked and stay quiet and low in the back of the truck. There are no windows to look through, so we just sit there wide-eyed and try to make sense of what we're hearing. My first thought My first gut feeling is that it's a person, one who is not mentally well and is intruding on our campsite, or someone with very bad intentions. And I want to clarify, the steps on the gravel sound was separate from the strange, vibrating, growling, buzzing sound that we were hearing. That sound was one of the most terrifying things I have ever heard in the woods in my life. I am familiar with fox calls. I've been in mountain lion country and listened to owls. I've been outdoorsy in the Pacific Northwest for almost 8 years now. This was like nothing I had ever heard, and like nothing I ever want to hear again. The sound was low to the ground, but on the left-hand side of the back of the truck where we were sitting, directly opposite us, as if it knew exactly where we were. We heard the sound again, and my boyfriend whispered to me that he was pretty sure it was some kind of animal. We heard the sound of something circling the truck, and then everything fell quiet for a while. When everything went quiet, Austin grabbed a knife and told me to go back to back with him since we had heard the sound on the driver's side last. He said that he would jump out of the back of the U-Haul on the right side. I would follow him with my flashlight, and he would climb into the front of the truck. I was to follow him and lock my door behind me. He said we were going to go find somewhere else to sleep, and at that point I was not about to disagree with him. Animal or not, he jumped out of the U-Haul, and I followed. The night felt oppressive, and all of the hairs on my body stood up. I could tell that we were being watched, and something felt very wrong. I swung my flashlight around in the dark, but it illuminated almost nothing. I quickly jumped in behind Austin and locked the door. We drove quickly out of that spot, deeper into the woods. We were both very shaken. In all of my time in the woods, I have never felt like something was wrong like that. We drive a little over 2 miles into the woods and find another turnoff. This one looks better than the last one. It's pulled farther into the woods. It seems more secluded. This pull-off looks like a driveway, and there is a path that leads further into the woods. The path is blocked by a single large stone in the center, clearly to deter people from driving further in. Austin and I get out of the truck, and with our flashlights go take a look around the area. The woods felt much friendlier here, and once we have established that we don't see anything out of the ordinary, and we're not getting any more bad vibes, we set up the truck once again and get ready to eat dinner. I'm still feeling kind of spooked about the whole ordeal in the last spot, so I'm talking to him about it. Just as we are getting comfortable, from the upper back left-hand corner comes a very loud, sickeningly disturbing humming sound. It sounded like a person was outside, humming from a higher pitch to a low tone, and it ended in the same growling, vibrating, menacing hum that we had heard before. Only this time it was louder and more intense than we had ever heard it, and right outside the U-Haul. I get hit with the worst gut feeling I have ever felt in my life. I look at Austin, and I whisper, "Holy shoot, we are being hunted." I was absolutely terrified that it was a group of people outside of our truck playing some sick game on us. And even more so because there wasn't even a remote trace of cell signal where we were camped. I know that if I dial 911, it will go through no matter if you have service. So I pulled up 911 on my phone and held it in my hand. I was getting ready to press the call button. The noise happened again, this time directly across from me and where I am sitting, low to the ground, like it knows that I'm afraid, and it knows that I'm sitting right there. I look at Austin, ready to press call, but he makes a strange face and whispers, "I think it's the truck. I think it's somehow a mechanical issue, and I'll be honest, I didn't buy it one bit." He doesn't have an idea as to what on the truck might be making that noise, but he explains that he thinks it's impossible that something followed us that far into the woods. I want to believe him, but we hear the sound again, and I am overwhelmed with terror. I am certain that it sounds too dynamic and intelligent. It is not a mechanical issue, and despite his best efforts, I can tell that Austin is also very freaked out. I get the overwhelming feeling that we should leave these woods, that it's wrong to be here. When the noises abate for a moment, he tells me that we will be leaving the back of the truck in the exact same way as before, back to back, with my flashlight trained behind him on the woods. He gets out first, flashlight and knife in hand, and I quickly follow, moving the flashlight beam into the tree line and around the side of the driveway, pull off where we were parked. I didn't see anything, but the woods were far too quiet and I knew we were being watched. These, however, were hammered into the ground in the shape of an X. I remembered that the humming noise outside of the U-Haul never, ever interrupted either Austin or I when we were whispering to each other. Not only that, but it seemed to listen, for when we were talking about it, almost like it was responding to us from outside the truck. We decided we don't want to sleep in the woods and start heading back to town. There were no vacancies at any of the lodges near us, so we decided to stay in a motel parking lot. Our plan was to wake up early enough that we would not arouse suspicion, and then pull into the Cougar Rock campground that we were trying to get to that night and score a spot in the early hours before anyone else got there. Austin says that he wants to step outside of the truck and stand where we heard the noise in the woods. I sit in the spot where we were sitting, and he stands outside of the truck. We waited for a long time, hoping to hear something like the terrifying sounds we were hearing, but we got nothing. So very disturbed, we sit down to try to eat some dinner. I don't really have an appetite at this point, but I'm trying to eat something anyway. At one point, while we are eating dinner, Austin reaches across the van, and a humming and buzzing noise that was very similar to what we heard in the woods happens. It's the truck, he explains. It has to be the truck. He rocked his weight back and forth from left to right, and as he did it, the buzzing noise happened consistently. I'm relieved, though we both agree that it was not the same sound that we heard in the woods the first or the second time. It's much quieter, though very similar. Austin said that it must be the metal of the truck settling, and it's triggered by weight shifts in the center of the vehicle between the tire suspension. And you know what? I'm ready to believe it at that point. I was very tired and was feeling soothed by being in such close proximity to people and civilization, and having cell service doesn't hurt at all either. I agree that it must be the truck, and we settled down to sleep. We were so spooked that we picked a parking spot under a bright lamp and wouldn't let each other go to the bathroom near the woods alone, but instead would accompany one another with flashlights and face the woods. As we slept that night, I was constantly woken up by the faintest and softest version of the humming and buzzing noise. It still had a strange feeling of otherness to it, but it was so much less scary. My boyfriend slept through it, but every time I heard it, my eyes would open. I thought that was odd because we didn't have very much room to sleep, and neither one of us tossed and turned that night. There was no weight shifting in the bed of the truck at all. The next morning we woke early and packed our things. We pulled off into the forest a final time at 6 o'clock before the entrance to Mount Rainier, to organize and so I could smoke some herb away from prying eyes. My boyfriend and I were reluctant to separate, but I didn't want the locals to see me smoking, and he wanted to tidy up the back of the vehicle where we slept in case someone from the park wanted to check it out and took offense. We discussed a signal for each other, and then I hopped out of the back of the truck and started my walk into the woods. I looked over at the road before I left, and saw a man in a big black truck pull into the ditch and start taking pictures of the U-Haul and me. I told Austin what was happening and he came out to look, and the man drove away. The full creepiness of the situation seemed to be hitting Austin, and he started saying that he really doesn't like this. I go take my walk into the woods, and the darkness is still sort of lingering in the trees as the morning comes around. It's hard to explain how I was feeling at the time. I felt kind of betrayed, almost like it was unfair that I had felt like the woods had kicked me out. I have always loved the forest. I wanted to know why someplace that has felt so safe and healing for me for so long had suddenly made me feel more terrified than I have ever felt in my life. And as I took my walk, I watched the tree line for any signs of movement. The path leads to a small clearing completely surrounded by woods. I felt almost like I was in some kind of courtroom. So I stood calmly in the center of the trees and looked out into the forest. I might be insane, but I audibly asked the woods why that happened to me. I told the trees that I didn't deserve that, and I got that really weird feeling again, but way subtler than before, almost sleepy. But all the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I just knew that I should leave those woods. I walked calmly and with my head high, smoking my herb stick all the way back to where we were parked. As I walk out of the forest path, to my left, in a ditch, is a bunch of very obviously super clear, dry firewood. It's not bundled together. It's thrown almost angrily into the undergrowth. But, do you know what I mean when I say that it's so dry that it's obvious and laughable and kind of weird? The rest of the wood and the plants and just foliage and scraps around it looks like it belongs there, but that looks like brand new super dry cured firewood. It was really creepy. I got very bad vibes. I tried to tell Austin, but he didn't hear me. A few minutes later, we were ready to go, and we drove into Mount Rainier National Forest. The woods felt instantly different, lighter, friendlier. Austin picked the hike because it was his birthday. He picked a 6-hour loop up the side of the mountain, and we came back to our campsite exhausted. It's important to note that we didn't actually get a real campsite, but we managed to find a spot in overnight camping, so we just set up the U-Haul again. We rested and camped and changed and argued and slept in the back of the U-Haul that day, and it never made the noise again. I even jumped up and down in the back of it to prove my point. Austin sort of realized how terrifying this whole thing was. I think he said that he did what he came here to do and that he was ready to go home now. We packed up all our stuff and we left. When we got home a day earlier than we were supposed to and had to call my dog sitter and let him know we were coming back. He is from Cuba and has some crazy stories about the supernatural out there. He said that it sounded a lot like a skin thing. I really don't want to say the name more than I have to. Or a Wendigo. Or I just got extremely lucky and we were actually being hunted by some crazy hills have eyes folk. We had this discussion as we were unloading the U-Haul for the final time into the house. He and I shook the U-Haul back and forth and finally determined that it could not have been the truck. This story takes place in Northeast Washington State. There is a very creepy mine hidden tucked away deep in the Northeast Washington State Colville National Forest, close to the Idaho border. I stumbled across it while rock hunting one day. It was a culvert you had to crawl through to get to the entrance on the side of a mountain. People had to be little to get in and out of this place, the opening only being 3 feet wide by 3 feet tall. Then as you got through the culvert, you could see the mine. The mine was barred off, welded across by iron bars 3 inches thick every 8 inches or so. Behind it you could see a sign made years ago, still legible, saying "Danger, do not enter. Mine could collapse, contain explosives, yet detonated, extreme sudden drop-offs, and low-level oxygen." As if that wasn't enough to freak you out, it was a smaller tunnel as I flashed my phone light down to see what I could see. A round bored-out rock that was drilled all the way through with about 6 inches of standing water on the floor of the mine. I saw what I could and made my way back down the mountain through the forest to my parked car about a half-mile down the uncharted path of brush, sticks, ponderosa pines, and rocks tripping you up constantly. I got into my car and went home. A friend had called me pretty drunk, asking me what I was up to. I said pretty bored on a Friday night. He was already in the driveway honking. "Let's go," he said. I grabbed a sweatshirt and jumped in. It was my buddy Andrew, his girlfriend Ariel, and I. I started drinking as they both were already pretty tuned up. We were cruising back roads and I started to get a bit tipsy. After 5 to 6 Coors Lights, I felt brave and said, "Hey, I know of this mine hidden a ways up in the mountains. Wanna get flashlights and check it out?" They were all excited. "Hell yeah," Andrew said. Little did I know that was one of the dumbest choices I have made, unknowing of the terror that lies ahead. It was about 2 in the morning when we set out towards the road where the mine was. We got there and the road had been Kelly humped to avoid any further vehicle travel. We got out stumbling around, making our way over the Kelly humps and started up the old U.S. Forest Trail. It was pitch black, so we used our phone flashlights to see. We could only see about 5 feet in front of us as it was very dark. The trail was covered with foliage and brush, making it a difficult but manageable trek. Then we heard it for the first time, like a child crying alone in the woods off in the distance. We all looked at each other and paused, thinking it was our mind playing tricks on us. We kept onward toward the mine I had discovered during the daylight. It wasn't too far of a hike, maybe 30 minutes up the trail through steep loose rock terrain. As we got closer a second time, we heard the baby cries just briefly and it was much closer. It was freakishly scary going towards the mine. As we got closer to the mine, we heard a low growl, then saw a silhouette of a tall, skinny humanoid creature. Then it came into view. It was bipedal, but its long, skinny legs looked broken as they were bent the wrong way. It was the most terrifying thing I've ever seen in my life, like something out of a horror movie. It then spoke the same thing I had just said moments ago to Andrew and Ariel, stating, "Come on guys, it's just a little further ahead," and sounded just like me without moving its mouth at all. That's what did it for me. And we all then knew we had been lured up closer to the cave by this thing, as if it knew we were coming. We all panicked and started to run back towards the car, everyone for themselves as we were unarmed, with the loose rock and Ariel being the slowest. She fell. Andrew and I heard a shriek and screaming and thrashing as whatever it was had gotten Ariel. Andrew and I expected the worst, as we had made it back to flat ground, still hearing what sounded like chewing, crunching, and just the most terrible sounds you could imagine. We both made it out luckily, got in the car and took off. I had to drag Andrew along as he didn't want to leave Ariel behind, but we both knew that she was gone. Frantic and still terrified, we decided to go back up there at first light. The next morning, we made our way back up the trail where Ariel was last seen, only to find blood everywhere. No pieces of Ariel's clothing and no sign of any remains. Did it take her whole body or consume it? What was that thing? We reported it to the police, and they sent a search and rescue team to cover the whole mountainside within a 10-mile radius. They searched hard for a good week and came back with no sign of anything. They called the search off. A couple days later, we saw a few National Guard vehicles and black SUVs with a helicopter searching the whole area. That part of the forest became a restricted area with no access to the public. Nobody knew anything, as they were keeping everything pretty secretive. Andrew and I were brought in for questioning by the guys in black suits. They said, "So your friend was mauled by a bear or cougar?" Andrew said, "No, it was something else, something not of this world." The guy in the suit then said, "We don't need to scare the public now saying some creature is loose in the national forest. So we need you both to sign a document stating that what you saw was just a normal forest animal and it attacked. We have everything taken care of, so there's no need to worry anymore." Andrew wanted to argue, but these guys looked very serious, and they meant business. So we did as we were told, and we could risk imprisonment if we ever spoke of this again. The government knew what was up there, and they either killed and disposed of it or captured it and moved it somewhere away from the public. They were acting very strange and secretive about everything. Still no body, no Ariel. She just vanished. No bones, clothing, or anything. So many people just vanished in the national forest and are unaccounted for. The government covers up the truth to not scare people away from camping or spending time in the forest because it's a moneymaker. Nowadays, you have to buy a pass just to park in nearly any national forest access. We know what we saw, and many other people have seen or encountered similar creatures. Were they made to be quiet as well? What is really going on in the national forests? This experience has made me second guess ever going camping again. I have been a ranger in the United States Forest Service for almost 15 years, but this takes place about 3 years after I joined. We were getting calls about a lone wolf with a collar hanging around campsites. Weird, since wolves aren't known to be in the area, but when you work in the field long enough you start to realize anything is possible. No calls had mentioned violent behavior from the animal, thank God. I departed from the station around noon to check out the places that it had been sighted. Wandered around for about 3 hours, no further calls during that time until I took a break for water. Sat down, had a snack, drank some water, and was getting ready to go again, when the thing was about 20 feet out, trotting near the tree line. It seemed friendly and had the collar, so I whistled at it and he came over to me. Getting a closer look, I could see it wasn't a wolf. It was huge, but it was dark and didn't have the right body structure, though I could see why it'd be confusing from a distance. I radioed in and reported that I had the dog with me, but as soon as I said I'd bring it in, the dog took off, like he was playing, to see how far he could get me to chase him. Typical dog behavior. I went after it, and I swear it was a game of chase for at least 5 minutes as we steadily ran through the forest. The dog finally slowed down near a rock bed or creek area and started pacing around a spot. I drew closer and didn't see anything off at first. Then I noticed that the overgrowth had almost disguised what appeared to be bones. I called it in immediately, and another team was sent to recover the remains. When I went to retrieve the dog, he was just gone. But, honestly, it wasn't a priority at that point. He was friendly enough, and I figured we'd catch up with him later. The bones were identified as a teenage male's. He passed away by a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. He'd been reported missing in the area long before I became a ranger, and there'd been pretty much no hope of finding him. I spoke to his mom on the phone. She called to thank me personally, and she asked how I'd found her son. I mentioned the black dog, then thought I'd said something wrong since there was a pause on her side of the line. After I gave a couple details about the dog, she quietly explained that her son, who struggled with making connections, had sunken into a deep depression after the death of his best friend, the very dog that had led me to him. I think I spent the rest of the day stunned. I continue to be in disbelief, in a way, but I know what happened. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest and was an avid hiker. In 2013, a group of friends invited me to go mushroom hunting in the Siuslaw National Forest, about an hour outside of Portland, where we lived. We spent significant time in the coastal forests, but mushrooms tended to cluster in areas with lighter foliage cover. Our de facto expert had experience foraging off of old logging roads and suggested a spot he visited the year prior. We drove to the end of a one-lane dirt road overlooking a deep ravine. Each of us put on our gear and bushwhacked through the comparatively sparse undergrowth, checking the leaves and debris for fungi. After about 20 minutes, I came across a small clearing of trees, perhaps a one-time campsite for loggers. About halfway across the expanse, I noticed something pink on the ground ahead. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. Resting on the leaves was the heart of an unknown animal, roughly the size of my fist, still untouched by the elements and fauna. There was no trace of a body in the immediate area, no other organs, remnants of flesh, or visible blood. It was spotless. The heart had no bite marks and the tissue was still dark red. I ran like hell back to the car. Mercifully, my friend decided to hang back. We rounded everyone up and left immediately. I have a photograph of the heart, although I wish I had taken one of the clearing. Please let me know if you have any explanations for this. It happened around Mount Hebo area.